Today's event is part of the Brave Voices, Brave Choices series presented by Howard County Library System and sponsored by Muslim Family Center, Howard County, and Reverse Consulting. Laila's books, Gaza Mom, Palestine, Politics, Parenting, and Everything in Between, and Gaza Kitchen, a Palestinian culinary journey, can be purchased through our local bookstore, The Last Word, or borrowed from the library. Laila El-Haddad is an award-winning Palestinian American author and journalist. She frequently speaks on the situation in Gaza, the intersection of food and politics, and contemporary Islam. She has written for numerous newspapers and magazines, including the Baltimore Sun, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and the International Herald Tribune, and has appeared on many international broadcasting networks, including NPR, CNN, Al Jazeera, and CCTV. Laila is also the co-editor of the anthology Gaza Unsilenced and contributor to the Immigrant Cookbook, Recipes That Make America Great. Her forthcoming book, Halal Tayyib, a Muslim American culinary journey, explores the history of Islam in America as told through food. Thank you so much for joining us today, Laila. And
it's
over
my
to you,
pleasure.
Ali.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you,
Over to
Rohini. And welcome, Laila, and welcome everyone who's joining us tonight. Before we begin our conversation, I would just like to take a quiet moment of reflection to offer a land acknowledgement. We respectfully and humbly acknowledge that we are on the ancestral land of both the Algonquin and the Iroquois people, and that the Piscataway tribe of the Algonquin and the Susquehannock tribe of the Iroquois both have long-standing traditions and connections to this region. We also acknowledge that legacies of violence, displacement, colonization, and broken treaties impact Indigenous communities. We wish to honor the Indigenous caretakers of this land, air, and water, the elders who lived here in the past, the Indigenous communities who reside here today, and the many generations to come. By offering this land acknowledgement, we honor the traditional stewards of this land in Howard County area and affirm that we will work to hold ourselves more accountable to the needs of Indigenous peoples. Thank you for joining me in the appreciation of that land acknowledgement. And now, Laila, I think we'll just get started with some questions for you.
Yeah.
To start, a lot of your work focuses on the intersections of food and history. They're completely intertwined, very influential on each other. What got you interested in this topic, and what prompted you to write The Gaza Kitchen?
Thank you, Ali. So, that's a great question. I actually grew up, like many Palestinians, in diaspora. I was raised primarily in Saudi Arabia in a Western compound. Both of my parents were from the Gaza Strip, and we would summer there frequently, but we were stateless, didn't have travel documents, and our trips back there, were always fraught with uncertainty. And our existence, like my existence, my childhood, I remember was defined by transience and temporariness, and it all kind of came to the forefront. I remember when I was in, I want to say, middle school or something, and we had a map project, and I couldn't find Palestine on the map, and it was this kind of traumatizing moment for a young person. Wait, do we exist? What's going on? And this was kind of the theme of my childhood that I think many a Palestinian can relate to. And I always like to say that food was this one place where I could locate myself. There's something very sort of visceral about food, and familiar and comforting and constant. And that was kind of the thing that I would always go back to, and made me want to know more, uncover it. It seemed to be this key to sort of an archaeological treasure trove of things that I could unearth about, our history and our legacy, a lot of which was erased and invisibilized. And it wasn't until I got older and I pursued a career in journalism that I began to shift towards the idea of using food as sort of a lens and a way to be able to tell a much more important and larger story. So that's kind of how I got into writing the Gaza Kitchen, and then into all this other business as well, my forthcoming book.
Thank you. And while you were talking, I put up a map that you had shared with us of that region.
Yeah, so if you could put that back up, yeah, I'll talk about that in a second. Well, maybe you can put it back up when we continue.
Yeah. So where does Palestinian cuisine and the cuisine in Gaza specifically fit into the broader region? And what does that inform us about culinary history?
Yeah, so Gaza, and this is where maybe you can put the map up. I keep wanting to look at you on a laptop, Ali. So Gaza occupies it's in the southwest of historic Palestine, and it occupies a very unique socio-political and geographic position, an historic position. And what I mean by that is it was sort of at the nexus of historic, not one, but multiple trade routes, sort of the theme of the evening, right? Not just the Silk Road, but also the ancient frankincense route, which brought, excuse me, which brought frankincense and myrrh from Yemen and Oman through the Naqab Desert to what was then the main port along the Mediterranean in Gaza. And it's kind of hard to think of Gaza as being a sort of a hub, but that's what it was, right? And then the third route was the Via Maris, the coastal road that went along that coastal area through Gaza northward. Excuse me. So because of that sort of unique position, it absorbed all of these different kind of influences and flavors. But and then bringing it kind of to the modern day, we don't think of Gaza in those terms, right? And we tend to kind of overlook it, and it's kind of has the unfortunate legacy of being viewed in these stereotypes and reduced to all these different tropes and so on and so forth. But if you look at it, excuse me, it's a reflection of this history. Of all of these different influences, and it differs, it's very distinct in terms of the immediate region, right? In terms of other Palestinian cuisine, in terms of the spices that you see reflected, it's much more piquant, it's a lot wider array of spices, it's, but also it tells us a lot and informs us a lot about, the history of the region, and how ultimately, like all cuisines in that area, not just Palestinian cuisine, but other Levantine and Arab cuisines, their origins all lie in Islamic history, right? And that's kind of the thread that ties all of these different countries together, is their acculturation under Islamic rule and how they absorbed all these flavors. We see that reflected not just in the food, but in the culinary habits and practices. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But the cuisine sort of shifting from Gaza to the cuisine of the Islamic world, including Palestine, it mirrors the conquests of the early Islamic era and the expansion. And Gaza was central to this in regards to its position in the Arabian trading routes that I talked about earlier. And it sort of, as the expansion occurred, you began to see trade not only to the Levant, but to Baghdad, to South Asia, to East Asia, and so on and so forth. And then all of the flavors, the culinary knowledge was absorbed and refined, right? And most notable among them was the Abbasid and Ottoman, but I'll get into that a little bit later.
Thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. And it kind of leads into my next question here, which is actually, can you tell us a little bit more about medieval Islamic culinary culture and cookery, and kind of discuss what the impact and lasting influences that those had, and how do we see that manifesting in our legacy today?
Yeah, I mean, this is like such a, you open this up and it's like a Pandora's box. There's so many really fascinating things on this topic. My brain is like working backwards, and I want to say one more thing about that last topic, which was, I talked a little bit about sort of historically the position of Gaza. I wanted to finish by adding that in the modern day, I was talking about it being a hub, and it's so hard for people to imagine that in the modern day. And one of the other reasons that motivated me to write about it, beyond what it tells us historically, is that it's so overlooked and kind of the most kind of isolated place on earth when we think of the world, that it's not a place that you naturally think of exploring or studying the culinary heritage of right. So that was another reason that I just felt like there was so much to share there, to learn, about my own personal history and so on, but also to document in terms of Palestinian heritage, as well. So, but then, going back to medieval Islamic culinary culture, it's really so incredible. Like the more I began to read about it and got interested in this topic, the more I was like, wow, like I didn't even know a lot of this information. So, to start, historians will tell you that Islam has the richest medieval food literature in the world, arguably in the world. And there were more cookbooks than any other place on earth before the year 1400, which is really incredible when you think about it. And it was a reflection of the diversity of the Muslim world at the time, of medieval Islamic culinary culture, which mirrored, again, the expansion of Islamic empire. And it was really, what was really interesting about it is it wasn't just, food for the sake of food, or it wasn't like, you had 100 recipes, whatever, or 100 ways to make squash, right? It was, I'll get into this a little bit more, but there was a real interest. It was a kind of a multidisciplinary field, right? That involved dietetics, nutrition. It was considered, you had medical practitioners, botanists. Everybody was kind of involved in writing these books, and that's reflected when you read them. Really interesting. But just backing up a little bit, food was not central to the culture in early Islam in the years in the 7th century, right, in the 600s. Food etiquette was, however, in early Islam, in the sense of there was a lot of instruction in Islamic prophetic teachings about how you should wash your hands and the way that you should eat and how you should share the food. So there was definitely a real emphasis on cleanliness and hygiene and food etiquette, but not like the actual foods, right? And that would primarily be because the diet of the Arabian Peninsula, consistent with people living in such an area, was dates, milk, dairy products, grains, vegetables that might have been cultivated in areas that were not nomadic but more sedentary in the south part of the peninsula, right? It wasn't really until you began to see the expansion, during first the Umayyad dynasty, right, and then after that the Abbasids, where things really kind of took off. And remember, this kind of blossoming happened as two other major empires were crumbling, right? You had the Romans, excuse me, and the Sassanid Empire, the Persians, right? And so as they were kind of, crumbling, you had the emergence of, and the expansion of the Islamic empires. But it's really interesting. And again, so a lot of what you see emerge in terms of culinary culture took its cue mainly from the Persians, a little bit from the Romans, but a lot of it from the Persians, right? Pre-Islamic Persia. But what was interesting, it wasn't until you saw this socio-political unification of this vast territory that you began to see sort of the dissemination of these crops that were otherwise kind of isolated, relegated to their specific areas. Two of the most important being rice and sugarcane, right, from India, that moved their way westwards across the empire as far as the Western Mediterranean, and kind of changed like the world as we know it, right? Both for good and bad, I would say. When Europeans began to develop this appetite for sugar, where previously it was just honey, they write about, you see these things where they write with a fascination about how there seems to be honey growing on like sticks, and how is this possible, not understanding initially that it was sugarcane, and their attempts to then obtain and in disbelief at how opulent medieval Islamic culture was in terms of the abundant use of sugar, where they were just had so much sugar that they were boiling it into syrups, and this had the Europeans puzzled, like, how is this possible? And making sugar syrups that you still see till this day in a Middle Eastern cuisine, right? Like almost all desserts are finished with a sugar syrup. That is a legacy of the medieval Islamic time. But it was this combination of traditional Arabic, nomadic cooking with the refined Persian culinary tradition and other regional practices that kind of resulted in what's known as the high cuisine of the time, right? And you see this reflected in the cookbooks, right? As I mentioned earlier, it was a combination of dietetics, agriculture, handbooks on etiquette, really interesting stuff, that get into a lot of detail, that talk about, the kitchen as a place, not just for cooking, but what for spiritual development and health. And so you had philosophers, medical practitioners. Like I said, this was food and the culinary arts were considered part, an extension of medicine. And medical treatises at the time approached food from this really like scientific standpoint, detailing like positive and negative effects, what you should eat depending on the season and your temperament, and so on and so forth, right? And so you had, you know, descriptions of, you know, and yeah, and in fact, there's a, I think it's slide 3, Ali. You see, there's before this one, there's a botanist, Ibn al-Bitar, a pharmacist, physician, culinarian. Really fascinating book that he wrote that depicts in great detail, you know, different medicinal plants and herbs and preparations for them. That was all kind of part of this culinary culture. This is one of the earliest, I think this is the 9th century or 10th century, if I'm not mistaken. And beyond that, like I said, food was considered medicinal. It wasn't just let's consume in a gluttonous way, but it was like, how can we eat with an eye to our health and caring for our bodies? And that was the other slide that you had shown, which depicts the one, slide 4, Ali. I don't know if you can pull that up, but it depicts preparing medicine from honey. And this is a 13th century technology that was on the stove this is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I think it was the other one that you showed a little while ago. It was slide 4. Yeah, that one. So this shows the preparation of medicine from honey from the 13th century using this technology that they had developed. So, excuse me. But these manuscripts, these cookbooks, you know, they weren't just cookbooks, right? They talked about things that seem irrelevant when I'm talking about them, but they really aren't, because anyone who cooks Middle Eastern cuisine will be like, oh, that's where that came from. We'll immediately understand what I'm talking about. For example, how you clean meats. There's a big emphasis in Middle Eastern cuisine and Islamic cuisine in general, I would say, not just in the Middle East, but across the world, in how you clean meats, right? So you never just, most Muslims will be aghast if you tell them that you take a piece of chicken from the supermarket and you kind of dump it in the pan or and you chop it up and you cook it, right? You always wash it in a little bath of like vinegar or lemon juice, flour, salt, strain it, right? And that dates back to this time period that I'm talking about, right? You had 3 major time periods. Like I said, it was the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Mughals, and the Ottomans, right? But it was really sort of I would say the Abbasids and the Ottomans where things really kind of flourished. But so they talk about how you cleanse and prepare meats. And a lot of this was with an eye to what was happening in Europe and the plague and whatever. So it was a real emphasis on cleanliness and hygiene, right? How you prepare meats, but also how you should cook. So you never use the same pot that you would boil meat in to ultimately finish your stew in, right? Is you boil it in one pot, you clean out the pot, or you use a separate one. This is a practice that you still see throughout all of the Middle East, and I would imagine much of the Muslim world, which is really interesting that kind of stuck through the years, right? This idea that, you know, you don't want to, and it probably had to do with like not tainting it, bacteria, whatever, which is really interesting. Other things that you see, legacies that you see, I think you had the slide up earlier. This is kind of a fun one, slide 4. There's a famous depiction of this in, you know, mentions of Saladin's encounter with King Richard. This isn't the depiction of that, but there's a famous encounter where Saladin offers him what was known in Islamic historical culinary textbooks as shorbat, right, which is sherbet. And it was ice that they would get from distant mountains that they would put distilled fruit, you know, syrups in. Distillery being another one of those inventions that happened around that time. And they would, and you know, Italian ices, things like that. So that's where that. So this is what this picture depicts here is a sherbet over ice, a fruit syrup over ice being served, which is kind of cool, I think.
It really is amazing.
Yeah. And you see a lot of these, but you don't always know what's going on in the picture. You know, you might see them in museums and then you're like, oh, that's really interesting. So it really shows you, I mean, the gist of all this is that really the theme is like, we're all kind of immigrants. Everybody was immigrating and coming and things were being absorbed and, you know, renewed and evolving and, you know, all the time. But it was this really incredible period. I don't know why I'm looking at the thing, but a really incredible period in history. So Muslim physicians, as I mentioned, they were using all of this knowledge. herbs, of spices, of food, and becoming at that time like an authority on, you know, what to eat and how. And again, certain dishes were considered to have therapeutic, medicinal value, and so on and so forth, helping the body. There's a lot of talk, you know, detailed in these manuscripts about how to fortify the body, how, you know, increase your immunity. And again, it dates back to a lot of the Islamic traditions and prophetic advice about, you know, there's one hadith, as we call it, that talks about the health, the responsibility of any person towards their body, that your body has a right over you. So the thinking was, okay, how can we kind of realize that in terms of, you know, what we've learned and acquired in terms of culinary habits and things like that. The other thing that should be noted specifically about the Abbasid era, right, the medieval Abbasid era, was that it was, anyone will tell you, it was a time of abundance and ostentation that many people will say ultimately led to the decline of that caliphate, because, you know, it was just so much. It was like over the top, right? But it was also a time, as I mentioned, of the codification of a lot of this kind of like etiquette, dietary hygiene, and a real quest. There was like this real interest in acquiring new flavors, right, and new ingredients and things like that. Another thing that was considered a violation of table manners was using a fork, because the idea was it was gross. How could you? Because remember, ordinarily there was a big platter and everybody would kind of sit around it. And the etiquette was you would only eat from in front of you. So using a fork to like dip it in your mouth and back in the thing was considered gross and unsanitary. So usually it was like with one's hands, and the idea was you just put it and your fingers wouldn't go in. And there was this is all like detailed in great length in these books, which is really cool, very interesting as well. There was a lot of talk about, they thought the frunge, what they referred to the Crusaders as the frunge, were like gross because they would suck on bones and things like that. That was considered really, you know, really kind of crude and, you know, not something that was very frowned upon, right? Another really interesting fact that I had picked up in my research was the idea of the sequencing of meals, right? A succession of courses, right? We look at modern day menus, appetizers, whatever, that also dates back to this time. And it was introduced by a really well-known polymath called Ziryab. And in addition to being a musician and a, you know, culinarian, he was a lot of other things, but he was the one that kind of took this knowledge from the Abbasid courts of Baghdad to Al-Andalus, to Spain, and ultimately to Europe, right? And the idea was, they talk about beginning your meal with something light, maybe dates, and then it would be on a low-lying table. You would have some cold starters and then some warm starters. And there's all this talk about like the heavier foods were thought, you know, they of course, a lot of it is incorrect, but the idea was, you know, you sequence them because the bottom of the stomach could, you know, digest heavier foods than the upper, and, you know, all this kind of business. But it's really interesting. So they talk in great length about these kinds of menus that they developed. You can see a lot of this evidenced in, if you see, go to slide 5, this is a cool illustration from a chronicle of recipes called the Book of Delights. This is from the 1400s in Mandu, India, and it shows one of the sultans, Ghiyath ad-Din, receiving dishes prepared in his kitchen, which was a common thing. And this, under the Mughals, they created a cuisine that was a confluence, where the Abbasids, it was kind of influenced by the Persians, and early Arabia, the Mughals was a confluence of Persian, Turkic, and Indian elements. So this depicts sort of a common sort of banquet scene there, where the Sultan is receiving all these different dishes. Yeah, and so, you know, I just want to keep track of time. Yeah, I'm doing okay. If you go to slide 10, I think it's slide 10.
Give me just a second there.
Okay, no problem. I want to talk about one like really iconic dish that has a legacy that we see in the modern day, and is a kind of an example of something that would have been really favored back then, and was kind of like, you know, the talk of the town, that people it came to be in disuse, lost interest in it in the area where it originated, but kind of evolved and moved on to other areas, right? And this was sikbaj. And sikbaj was kind of this way to prepare either meat or fish by soaking it in vinegar. Sounds familiar, right? And then sweetening it with some kind of sweetener, usually honey, date molasses, something like that, grape juice. And this was kind of a theme of Persian cooking, and as well as Roman cooking, is this idea of mixing meat with fruit and something sweet or sour. It fell into disfavor in the area where it originated originally, but it moved on from there to Al-Andalus, to Spain, to Latin America, in the, in the Colombian exchange, and so on and so forth. In Spain, you see it reflected as ceviche, and then you see it reflected as ceviche, right? In Latin America. So even though it's no longer cooked in the Arab world, its memory lives on in all of these other variations. So that's just a fun fact. Next time you eat any of these two dishes on the right, you can remember that this is, ultimately where it originated. And it also tells you about, it's really cool how dishes and ingredients travel, and we just have no idea how interconnected, everything is. Another really cool legacy that I like to talk about is coffee, right? When we talk about spices, by the way, it's not limited or the culinary arts just to food, as I've kind of demonstrated. It was kind of the whole field, right? Everything together. You could see if you pull up the slide 8, this is a really neat one. So here on the left, you see kind of the hustle and bustle of a classic Ottoman coffee house. And on the right, you see kind of echoes of it in the modern day global coffee franchises. And it's not just the coffee that's being consumed, but it's these connotations of kind of like, cultural associations, educated intelligentsia, where the kind of, urban elite would gather. Coffee was the favored, as they say, choose your poison drink of the scholars, right? Where alcohol was forbidden, but not, it was consumed by people who obviously might have not been practicing. There's documentation of that, as well as other religious groups that lived in Islamic empires were allowed to make alcoholic beverages, but the scholars shunned it, the scholars, and their beverage of choice was coffee. So this is reflected here. And it's kind of cool that you could see that reflected in the modern day scene of coffee houses. And this would be in the Ottoman era again. So much later on after the Abbasid era, when coffee was not yet a thing, right? And then finally, there's another slide, that about one more dish that has kind of made its way to the modern era. And this is one of the much earlier on, one of the very early dishes. I talked about how food was not a huge thing in early Arabia. The one exception would be this dish on the left, which still exists, called Ferid. And it was one of the most beloved dishes of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And it was essentially like moistened bread with broth, right? So a layer of bread with broth and meat and vegetables. And you still see iterations of this, in different parts of the Muslim world. You see it represented in the genre of fettas, which is like same thing, breads with meat or rice. Rice, of course, would not have yet existed at that time. You see this in the Levant all over the place. You see different versions of it in Morocco. But here on the right, this is something new that I have, and I thought this was kind of cool. You see the kind of modern day equivalent of it that made its way across through all these different trade routes in Mexico. So I thought that was kind of a neat one as well. Pasta is another one that people, I think, don't realize that made its way through the kind of hard durum wheat that was introduced by the Muslims into Sicily and Spain in the 10th century, rather than the rice-based noodles from China. So like the kitchen, really the legacy of that time it's so huge, more than I can talk about in this amount of time, but it was really a place of spiritual, development and health, as much as it was refining the culinary arts. And so I think, I could keep going on that, but
let's shift gears a tiny bit.
Sure.
And talk about the spice routes. Can you talk a little bit about how Muslim traders controlled various spice routes from late antiquity through the Middle Ages?
Yeah, absolutely. So beyond, yeah. In fact, I think I have a map up there on slide 2. But sorry, I'm a very visual person, so I love showing pictures. But this is really cool because it's kind of like hard to wrap your head around. Okay, everything you said makes sense, but how did this go from there to there to there to like China to I don't know where to this is how, right? It wasn't just, you had obviously the land territorial expansion and the confluence of all these different cultures that happened as a result in the trade and the and so on and so forth. But it was really with the maritime trade trade routes and spice routes that things began to flourish, right? Now, just around the time that, Islam was born and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, received the message, the Arabs were kind of already controlling the Red Sea trade and the spice routes of the Persian Gulf, as well as significant routes. But it wasn't until later that they would begin then to control significant maritime trade routes that would take them to South China, Eastern Africa, from the Arabian Peninsula. Mm-hmm. And this spice trade was dominated by Arabian merchants very significantly. And it flourished, and they gained almost a total monopoly on it, right? From Europe to China within the next couple of centuries. Mm-hmm. And this is why this becomes significant. In the 9th and 10th centuries, you had Arab physicians using these spices. I talked a little bit about this earlier. It wasn't just spices at this time were not just being used to flavor food the way that we do today. Not in the area where we're talking, and not in Europe either, right? They were used, to produce syrups and make extracts, but they were also using them to invent distillation techniques to purify essential oils from aromatic plants. And that was what I had referred to earlier in that depiction by the botanist, right? But it wasn't until 1453, in the fall of Constantinople, that capital of the Byzantine Empire, of course, that was conquered by the Ottoman Empire, that the principal land route for spices into Europe, into the West, was lost. And that was created a real crisis for Europe, right? And, the spices were used, obviously, like I said, in food preparation in Europe, if we want to understand what they were being used for. Ginger, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, saffron, anise, cumin, cloves, all of these things. They were mainly reserved for the tables of the rich, but the poorer classes used them when they could, especially pepper. That was the biggest one, right? And in fact, the fall of Constantinople was probably the major motivating factor for the so-called Age of Exploration, right? That created this desire to have a direct access to these lucrative trade routes that would circumvent the Muslims. Now, that ended up very violently, because whereas before it was more, I would say, benign, this quest ended up obviously in violent colonization, holding of territory, enslaving of indigenous peoples, this quest for all things spice related, sugar, et cetera, right? So it doesn't end obviously in the best way, but you can see how everything is really interconnected, and how these trade routes, both land and maritime, when we're talking about, literally, extended their reach from all over more than any other time, I think I would say. And then that went from this region to Al-Andalus, to Spain, to Italy, to ultimately, across the Atlantic. And then, of course, I won't get into after that with the Columbian Exchange. You have a lot of other ingredients that make their way back, right? That you see represented in modern day Islamic cuisine as well. Yeah, but I think I'll end there, because I want to also show you an example of a dish in a bit.
Yeah, we've been looking at these beautiful ingredients laid out in front of you for a while now, and you're going to be preparing something for us to lead us through this. Can you tell us a little bit what you're making and a little bit about the history of that dish?
I can. It's one of my favorites, and I was trying to think initially. I usually try to keep things seasonal, and eggplant isn't, very seasonal. But the reason I chose this dish is because it has a really cool connection with everything I was talking about. It's a classic dish called rumaniya, which means the pomegranate dish, that's prepared not only in Gaza, but in surrounding towns of Jaffa and Lid. And it's an ode to kind of this medieval Islamic cookery, because a dish by the same name is documented in these early Islamic cookbooks with different components, a little bit different components. The common ingredient is the rumman, which is pomegranate, right? And rumman, the pomegranate that would have been used, and that's still used actually in Palestine, is not this, the one that we're familiar with, but its cousin, which has a green exterior, and it's actually called a white Babylonian pomegranate. And they use it to extract the sour juice. And sour juice was a very common way of infusing dishes, as I talked about, with this kind of tart flavor that has in the modern day in the Middle East been substituted with tomato, but that wouldn't have existed, right? Because it was brought over, it was a New World ingredient. So this pomegranate juice is the common ingredient in both of these dishes. And it's just cool that you see this dish in, cookbooks from the, 13th and 11th century or whatever, represented. Now, interesting note about why eggplant would not have been in the earlier dish, because eggplant was considered poisonous, being part of the nightshade family at the time. And it, medical practitioners thought it was poisonous and were instructing people not to consume it. But you had these culinarians who, when they like finally tasted eggplant, were like obsessed with it. And it's really funny because there's a famous poem by one, such culinarian who writes, "The doctor makes ignorant fun of me for loving the eggplant," and he talks about his love affair with the eggplant. And he compares it, I want to keep it PG, but it's probably the most like racy poem written about an eggplant, right? He talks about how, it's like the exchanging kisses with a, lover or something like this, right? So, but I can't resist the eggplant. What should I do? And then the doctor's telling me not to eat it, right? And then slowly but surely the eggplant found its way into the cuisine, but it wouldn't have been, in earlier in that part of the. So without further ado, I'm going to make, excuse me, post COVID, I'm going to make the romania for you. It's one of my favorites because it's for people who are vegetarian and vegan. It's very friendly to people who don't consume all those things. It's meat and so forth. Excuse me, hacking up the storm here. Just 1 second. I'm going to move this out of the way. So it's very simple. It's essentially, you start off by boiling some brown lentils, which I've already done, right? And you can see that here. And I'm happy to provide this recipe for anyone interested. So you boil the brown lentils until they're tender, which I've already done. And then you chop up an eggplant. And I used, Japanese eggplant because they're more readily available at this time of the year, but also they have a little bit of a sweeter flavor, which I like. And I've just chopped one up, and you just kind of dump it into the, with the cooked lentils. And then while that boils, and that doesn't take long, it just takes, because the lentils are already cooked, comes together super quickly. You're going to add the thickeners and the flavorings, right? So in Palestinian cuisine, you often, and through Levantine cuisine more generally speaking, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, you always see the addition of sesame seed paste, tahini, right, to thicken stews. And in Gaza, they use a specific kind that's a roasted sesame paste. So I recently was in Turkey and was really like delighted to have found it in a shop that like makes it, grinds it. So basically what I'm going to add to that right now is, and if this was to be made in Palestine, specifically in Gaza, they would not be using lemons. They would be using the juice of the Babylonian pomegranate, right? It's a separate tree. But because that doesn't exist here, it probably does in California, I substitute it with lemon juice and pomegranate molasses, which, is the concentrated version of that white pomegranate. But this can be found in any store, even grocery stores have it now. So basically I'm going to add the juice of 2 lemons with a little pomegranate molasses, and then thicken it up with the tahini, a couple of tablespoons of that. And then I'm going to add some of the spices, and I'll tell you about that in a second. So I just have the lemon juice. I'm going to dump in this. My mother would probably have a fright right now because she's always like, aren't you measuring? I don't measure. I'm not a big measurer, but I just kind of eyeball it. So I'm just whisking the lemon, and it just the lemon juice gives the pomegranate molasses already sour, but this kind of gives a little, because this is supposed to have a sour and sweet taste to it. And then I'm going to also add flour to thicken it a little bit more. You don't have to if you're gluten-free. You can omit this, or you can put some other substitute. But sometimes if it comes out too liquidy, the flour helps. And you kind of want to make a slurry, because otherwise you will end up with a gloppy mess, and it will not do well if you put it in the heat. So you always want to mix the flour in something cold. So that's done. And I'm just going to add that to the eggplants. And give it a quick stir. And while they are happily boiling over there, I'm going to do the next part, which is the spices. And in Gaza, we use this clay mortar and this lemonwood pestle, which I love. They're called zibdiya, and they're used to crush spices in, to bake in, to serve salads in. And it's, mortars and pestles are not unique, but the use of them in Gaza specifically is. They don't use them elsewhere in Palestine. And Gaza has a long history and tradition of pottery making. But it's just kind of one of those things that is, I love. It reminded me of home. And because of the blockade on Gaza, they're very hard to obtain. And any Palestinian from there usually will have one. So they're fantastic. So I'm looking for the salt. Can I go over here, or am I going to remove the microphone? Let's see. So what I'm going to do is add a little salt. It gives friction anytime that you're grinding stuff. You could use a granite mortar and pestle. So to the salt, I'm adding dill seeds, and dill seeds, which is the seed of the dill weed that we all know, is really popular in Gaza for some odd reason. It is not used pretty much anywhere else in the immediate region. And it may be an influence, who knows, as long as dill, with Gaza being along the Mediterranean and close to Greece, but no one can be certain how these things came to be. So I'm just in a circular motion. I'm going to crush the dill seeds. This thing reminds me of my grandmother, who herself was Circassian, and my great grandmother, who herself was Kurdish. They all hated cooking. So does my mother. But again, I have a sort of a historic fascination with it more than a, but she used to always tell me, grind as though you mean it, with some muscle. Don't grind like a wimp, you know? So, but this is one of those kind of earliest, most visceral memories. It's smelling the, you know, the essential oils of the dill wafting up as you do this. It's very therapeutic too. Highly recommend it. Better than a spa. So grind, and then to that you add a couple of dried chili flakes. I'm gonna omit them because my husband can't tolerate them. But this is the point where you would add them. And Gaza uses a lot of heat. And again, this would be a New World ingredient that somehow at some point made it to Gaza. Who knows? It might have been a ruler at the time in ancient times who really liked this. But it's, again, hot peppers are not used elsewhere in Palestine. But for some reason in Gaza, they love their heat. They love chili peppers in all their forms. Grind the red chili peppers. And then finally, garlic. Can I step away for a second? I just realized I forgot the garlic. I'm going to grab that really quickly. Let's see. Will this work? Who knows?
Well, Laila is picking up the garlic. If anyone who's in our audience tonight has some questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A.
Yeah, and I'm happy to field them as I'm going here. I'm almost done.
We've got a couple about the spices, actually. So Laila, were spices, how did people actually gather those? Were they farmed and cultivated, or were they more foraged, or a combination thereof?
You know what? That I don't have an extensive knowledge of, but I do remember reading that it was a combination, I want to say. And then later on, I think Europeans, as they began to send their own explorers, began to realize that this country is known for that, this bark grows there. I think the role of when the Muslims were controlling the spice route wasn't so much the cultivation, but more the trade. So that's where they kind of came in, right? It's kind of the same, I would say, as if an area is known for a coffee bean or a cocoa bean. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be great at getting it places or even the preparation of it or whatever, right? So there's all these different stages involved. So, but that's a really good question. It kind of makes me want to explore it a little bit more. I wish I could provide a more thorough answer.
And are there any spices that are truly considered hallmarks of contemporary Palestinian cuisine?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Contemporary Palestinian cuisine, was heavily influenced, and I would say vice versa, by the last Muslim, ruling empire, which was the Ottoman, right? You see that reflected in the dishes, both in Palestine and in Turkey. When you go to modern day Turkey, you see a lot of that reflected, that they absorbed a lot of the influences of the areas they were ruling over and vice versa. But I would say the exception to that is allspice. That would be the main spice used not only in Palestinian cuisine, but also in Lebanese, Syrian, not so much, but I would say Lebanese, Jordanian, Palestinian cuisine. Allspice is like the major ground allspice, the major spice that's used. In Palestinian cuisine, it would be allspice in addition to, cumin, cinnamon. I feel like I'm missing something here. Cumin, cinnamon, allspice, turmeric is a big one, cardamom, you know, in Gaza, I would say we use an abundance, a bit more spices than you would see in other parts of Palestine. But those are kind of the big ones.
And those have been considered necessities throughout
Cloves, yeah, I'm just going in my mind here. Sorry?
Yes, those are things that have been necessities throughout the culinary history and still resonate in cuisine today.
Yeah, so a lot of this, like I said, things definitely were not the same. If you were looking at the way, there's certain dishes that have kind of stood the test of time that very interestingly, you see them, you know, there's like two that I can think of the top of my head. There's a lot of techniques that stood the test of time. You see those, like I talked a little bit about them. But there's certain dishes that for whatever reason, they have not changed. They've been around since like, you know, the year 900. And those would be molokhia and altai. So molokhia is sort of a green gloppy stew that sounds gross, but it's delicious. And it's a mallow leaf that's chopped up and mixed into a broth with chicken and meat. And the original meaning is the food of kings, right? And it's, you know, originally probably from Egypt, but also throughout the Levant. This is one that you see in these medieval cookbooks and even earlier that are still eaten today. Al-Taif is the other big one, and it's a popular Ramadan during the month of fasting dessert, like a stuffed pancake that you fry with cheese and nuts. That was documented in great detail, and the recipe like pretty much hasn't changed. So that's another interesting one. A lot of other dishes that you see in the modern contemporary times use New World ingredients that wouldn't have existed back then, but you might see skeletal version of the dishes that definitely were still in the book. So it hasn't like drastically changed. You see, you could recognize things and go, oh yeah, you know, we make this now, but it's, instead of using, like I said, pomegranate juice, we might use tomato, or instead of using, so you definitely see that. But I would say it's a kind of a confluence of Ottoman influence, of, you know, some of the earlier influences, for sure.
So what step are you taking now? Are you adding the
yeah, so I just added right now the crushed garlic with the salt and the dill seed and cumin. And cumin is always used, going back to spices, in conjunction with any legumes like lentils, chickpeas, because it's considered to be good for digestion. Like it counteracts the, you know, bloating or whatever might result from those kinds of, you know, beans and things like that. So yeah, I just added those all in, and then that's just going to kind of boil down for a couple more minutes. And then the last thing I'll do is add the tahini, and then I'll like pour it in a bowl and show you. So it comes together super, super quickly. But, you know, I will say about like modern contemporary Palestinian cuisine is that because of the physical separation of Gaza from the other parts, from like the West Bank, there is no longer that kind of exchange. And the cuisine there in Gaza is very much like, you know, people aren't encountering it, or it's not changing, or, you know, because it's kind of off limits. Not even other Palestinians can go there. Of course, with the modern day and the internet and so on, people can sort of reach it that way. But yeah, it's interesting. There's kind of like a stagnation, and because of the political situation, most of the population are now, you're seeing kind of a reversal. They're not another change. And I'm sure this will, at some point in history, people look back and go, well, wait, when did they stop using olive oil or these spices? We talk about tahini, you know, I'm using it tonight, sesame seed paste, or some of these spices now would again be considered kind of prohibitive for 75% of the population, you know, who are kind of in dire need, would not be able to afford using olive oil abundantly anymore, or using tahini because it's considered expensive. They would only use it in small rations, like single unit portions, right? So that's important to note as well. When we're talking, food is still a very privileged way to be able to talk. And I think this is pretty much universal. Like even during medieval times, a lot of the people writing these books and cooking were the ones that were kind of more the upper class and the elite. But it was with an eye to how can we make this accessible to the broader population, right? Not just consume it ourselves.
So one of the things we talk about when we talk about like really connecting with our food and our culinary history is connecting with in-season produce and herbs and things that we can grow locally and access seasonally. What are some of the standout seasonal ingredients that you like to use in cooking? What's your favorite winter?
And that was what I was torn about. I was like, oh man, they would never. people cook very seasonally in, in the Middle East and in Palestine specifically. That's what I love about when I'm traveling anywhere, really, right? It's not just there. I'm like, man, we're so out of touch here in America. Why are we cooking with tomatoes in December, But anyway, the thing that I love to cook the most with in the winter is chard. I actually have it growing in my garden. And that was the other thing I was considering making, is a very simple but hearty chard and lentil stew that has similar flavor profile with the dill and the cumin and the chili peppers. That it goes great here in the snow, in the rain, it's very hearty. So that would, and it's like the go-to green, I would say, in Gaza. We use it in a lot of our dishes. So that's my favorite one. And it's very versatile as well. In other parts of Palestine, they roll it and stuff it, but mainly they chop it up and they make, like the way that you would make spinach pies out of it, you would make a savory pie. They, cook it into stews and things like that.
I'm going to have to get that recipe from you because I've tried.
Yes, absolutely. It's so easy.
Favorite.
It's so easy. I love it. I'm not a huge meat eater. I do eat meat, but I lean towards vegetables. So
yeah, and chard's a wonderful, healthy, filling green that can be kind of hard to find sometimes, even when it's in season locally.
Right. So the variety that grows in the Middle East is actually a more tender, more closely resembles spinach than it does like the huge gargantuan chard leaves that you see here. But ultimately it's the same family, but it's just, you don't have those huge leaves that you see in the supermarkets here.
So if anyone in our audience has any questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A or the chat. We did get one question about sumac. Is sumac something that's used a lot? Is that a traditional?
Yes, in fact, do I have it here? I always just eat it like I would. I'm trying to see. Gosh, I eat it the way I would eat, Sour Patch Kids or something. Oh, I love it. I even make a sumac like lemonade, which is amazing. And it's funny because when you say sumac here, people think it's poisonous, which it's not. But that's, I completely failed to mention when I was thinking, I was like, I'm missing something. This is the other really, really key spice. I don't even know if I call it a spice. It's a berry in Palestinian cuisine. So there's another dish that is called sumacia. And iya, when any a dish ends in iya, this is another thing that you see in a lot of these, in the genre of medieval Islamic cookbooks, is dishes that end with iya was a way to describe the dish by the ingredient or the region, right? So say something was, from Baghdad, they would call it Baghdad iya, right? Dimashq, like Damascus iya. So this dish is called sumac iya because it's made during the Eid holiday after Ramadan in Gaza, and it's made with sumac and chard and lamb and chickpeas. But it's amazing. Like I said, I like to just this is really good. This is, a Palestinian company that makes this. And I like to nibble on it. It's amazing. It's so tart and sweet, but yeah, it's not poisonous for sure. So I was really lucky. I know, otherwise I would be. It's very tart. So it lends a really kind of tart, but fruity, makes you pucker, flavor to dishes. Right. And you see it used in all kind of, as I say, they sometimes bastardize dishes or ingredients by using them in weird ways in contemporary cuisine. Yeah, sorry, I see my kitties here trying to get into the picture. But anyway, I was really lucky 2 years ago. I had a chance to go to Bethlehem and meet with a really kind of up and coming Palestinian chef. And he got me some fresh sumac from a tree, which was really neat because something I think that people have to understand for Palestinians, for a lot of us, it's very difficult to have access to our ancestral lands because of various policies that restrict our movement. So it was a real special treat and including the lands where certain things grow, right? Where I would be able to see a sumac tree or, an olive tree or something like that, or cultivate wild zatar is the other one, right? The zatar leaf, which is kind of in the family of oregano and thyme, is probably the most symbolic and commonly used herb, not spice, in Palestinian cuisine. But anyway, so it was a special treat because I usually can't access those places to go, and he showed me around and got me the sumac.
And somebody had just asked about Zatar, so I'm glad you mentioned.
Yeah.
We're getting lots of questions about just
here.
local.
This is how it looks after it's excuse me, after it's dried and rubbed with olive oil. And sumac is added in there, and then sesame. And we usually dip it with bread in the morning or top it on our breads, you know. Yeah, sorry, someone was saying what?
We've got a lot of questions about where can you find some of these ingredients locally? Are there any sources that you recommend that?
Yes, in fact, excuse me. I'm just going to check that the eggplant is ready without like scalding myself and getting it everywhere, which
of course
I already did, but okay. Just 1 second. Yeah, it tastes amazing. Let me chew. Yes, so a lot of the ingredients can be, obviously spices can be found anywhere. I don't like to buy them from supermarkets because they're really expensive. I usually like to buy them, you know, either online. Sometimes I buy them in like, you know, in the packages, like the 1 pounder, and I put them in my fridge. I always thought it was fun. That was one of my first impressions of America when I came and I was 18. I'm like, why do they buy spices in little 4-ounce things? You know, I'm sure anyone can relate to this, but yeah, you know, our pantries are always full with weird, odd shaped bottles with like, you know, refilled with spices. But you can also do them in like the bulk section, maybe if you don't want to use a lot in like Whole Foods or something like that. You can go to, there's a lot of Middle Eastern and South Asian markets throughout the Howard County area that you can get them at. That's another great place. In terms of other ingredients that are not spices, like I said, it's really, you could find like the pomegranate molasses. I think Giant has it. I've definitely seen it at Whole Foods. If it's not there, then there's a lot of Middle Eastern markets. I like to go, it's called Jerusalem Market in Windsor Mill / Gwyn Oak area. It's not too far from here. I would say 20 minutes. They probably have the best selection of Palestinian ingredients. That's where I got the sumac and the pomegranate molasses and everything else. So that's kind of my go-to. But if you don't want to go that far, there's other Middle Eastern markets around here. I'm trying to think.
Someone in the chat had just mentioned that Jerusalem Market was a great one, and somebody else has mentioned the Catonsville Food Cooperative as a good resource.
Oh, really? I didn't even know about that one. It's interesting. Catonsville Food Cooperative, is that what it's called?
Yes, Catonsville Food Cooperative.
Okay, cool. Huh? Yeah, I'll learn something new every day. I'm just, by the way, adding the tahini in here. So I'm adding like about 2 tablespoons. And you usually do that at the end, because if you do it too soon, it thickens up very quickly. So you don't want to do it too soon. And then I'm just going to like pour it out. And this is a type of dish, by the way, that you would eat at room temperature. So not really warm. There's a whole genre of these dishes that are like cooked and served in bowls and like allowed to kind of congeal. And then you eat them with bread, right? So you would not eat them with a fork and a spoon or whatever. I'm going to just do a little sample bowl for everyone to see.
Yes, we're definitely getting some notes in the chat that people want to see the final product. And
oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I wouldn't let you go.
A question that I was hoping you could address. I love to use tahini in my cooking, but it always separates. How do you do you advise using it when it's separated, or is it better to stir it up? Or
that's a really good question, and I wish I had a conclusive answer. I'm gonna have to, because as you see, when I got this out, I panicked because I was like, oh my god, it separated. But it was still okay, because sometimes what happens is it separates and the bottom becomes like like a brick, and then I can't use it anymore. And I've tried but I never like to throw things away. It's this weird trait I inherited from my mother, who probably children of, you know, grandparents from the Depression can relate, but nothing ever can go to waste in a Palestinian kitchen ever. So even if there was like bits of hardened tuna, I would throw them in my Vitamix and like, you know, but I would say I've learned for whatever reason that it's better to put it in the fridge.
Okay.
I noticed that if you put it out in the pan, I think they advise the same with different nut butters. If it's really raw and pure and you stick it in the pantry, it's going to separate and harden much quicker. If it just newly separates, you can still stir it, but you'll notice if it's separated and it's been a while, the bottom will get hard and then it's kind of like no good. You could still use it. I don't like to throw things away. So I would, if I'm making hummus, I would stick it, but with liquid in the Vitamix. But that would be my advice, is to put it in the fridge. And if it begins to separate, just stir it, you know. My mom sometimes flips it upside down. That's another trick you could try.
That's what I do sometimes, and that sometimes helps too.
By the way, I'm just adding, this dish is always topped with caramelized onions that I pre-did these because they take a while. So I'm just kind of putting that on top. And I personally like to decorate it with, whoops, I just went flying everywhere, with fresh dill, just for the color, totally optional, but it's beautiful. I love dill. And a few pomegranate arils. And again, that just gives it a really beautiful color, like little jewels.
That looks
And
delightful.
you could also, yeah, and you could also, and then we always top everything for whatever odd reason in the Middle East with more olive oil. Like we don't have enough oil in our lives, but that's usually how it goes. And yeah, you could also put some chili flakes on there. I'm not going to because my husband, who's watching me over there.
Do I get to eat it?
Yes, I made this for you. So that's, I don't know if you can, you want me to, it's going to spill if I, but I can put it here for you to, is that good? I don't know.
There we go. Yes, that does look amazing. And we'll get that recipe from you and send it out to everyone by email.
Absolutely. This is one of my favorites. And I always have a fear that I'm going to overdo it because I love to make this, but it's just such a winner because it just, the flavors just kind of pop in your mouth. There's so many great flavors in here. You know, you have the sort of tartness from the pomegranate and the sweetness from the caramelized onions, and you kind of have the earthiness from the cumin, and everything kind of comes together in a really delightful way, especially in the winter when usually this is made in like late fall, I would say, not late fall, when the pomegranates are in season. And the eggplants are still kind of end of summer. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Laila. That kind of brings us toward the end of our time for the evening. I do just want to ask one more question.
Yeah.
If you could pick any Palestinian dish, what would be your favorite?
Oh man.
And I know this is probably the hardest question to ask you.
You know, it's funny because there's dishes that I think back like from my childhood or ones that I really like, but I can't make regularly because I can't get everyone to agree in the household of 6 that we have on on consuming it. But man, that's a tough one. I'm trying to think. What do you think, Yassine? What's your favorite? My husband is from northern part of Palestine. I'm from the south, so the flavor profiles are very different. But I would say my husband says ma'duba, which is kind of an iconic Palestinian dish that means upside down. And it's kind of like a, you know, almost layers of, you know, rice packed with stewed chicken or lamb with vegetables with, you know, all packed together and simmered in this broth that kind of steams through the whole thing. And then you flip it upside down onto a plate. And that's kind of a iconic, almost like Friday family meal. For me, I would say anything seafood. I just love the coastal cuisine of Gaza, and all of Palestinian coast is just amazing. So any of the fish, they make a lot of really amazing stuffed squids in Gaza, calamari, you know, with rice. They make a shrimp clay pot baked, a shrimp bake. That's incredible. So I would be preferential to that. Whenever I have a chance to go visit, I'm like, I don't want anything. I just want seafood. So there's something different about the flavor of the Mediterranean fish, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting us into your home and letting us take over your kitchen for this presentation.
It was my pleasure. I hope I didn't go too fast. I know there was a lot of information. It was kind of all over the place. But
no, it was fantastic. And I, again, want to thank our sponsors for the evening, the Muslim Family Center of Howard County and Rivas Consulting of Howard County. We really appreciate their support. And I'm going to go back to Rohini here if she's ready for us. But again, just wanted to say thank you, and we really appreciate it. We really look forward to getting those recipes.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I'll be sure to share that with you.
Well, that was a fascinating talk, fascinating history, tempting recipes, and a warm, warm conversation. What a wonderful way to spend an evening together. Thank you, Laila. Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Ali, for making this evening happen.